Hello and welcome to This Week in Travel. I'm Michelle Robson, your host and editor of Turning Left for Less. This week I'm going to be talking about the latest news, including a rumoured Concorde room at Heathrow's Terminal 3 and Finnair's changes to baggage and One World benefits. As you can see, if you're watching on YouTube, I'm not at home. I'm actually in Cape Cod in Hyannis at the Anchor Inn, and you can see the harbour behind me. The rest of this programme will be dedicated to the apps and websites that make your travelling life easier. So I'm here in the Finger Lakes region, which is near Niagara Falls, I guess is the nearest place you've probably heard of. It's in America in New York State. It's about 6 hours drive from New York, or about an hour's flight. And it's known for, funnily enough, its lakes and waterfalls, but also it's really well known for its wine, which is why I'm here. And today I'm going to be sampling some wine. So I'm really looking forward to that. And obviously I'll report back on how I found the region. First of all, I'm going to talk about the news today. So there was some interesting news for British Airways customers with the chance of a Concorde room or something similar at Terminal 3. There's been rumours for a while that something big was brewing in the terminal for the BA lounge, but now the rumours seem to be suggesting that it is a Concorde room. Several people have been told this when visiting Terminal 3, so it's looking like it's actually going to happen. Apparently it's due to happen by July. We're not sure if it's actually going to be a proper Concorde room or whether it's actually just going to be a bar. If it was to be a bar, it's not clear whether Gold Guest List customers would be able to access it, because technically they can only access Concorde rooms, but it just seems to vary by location as to what you're allowed to do. So we'll wait and see what happens. But overall, I think it's good news, because the Terminal 3 lounge has never been that great if you're flying in first class or were Gold Guest List. And most people will normally just go to the other lounges like the Cathay Lounge or the Qantas Lounge. I'm guessing that it's not only that British Airways want to make it a better experience for their customers, but it probably costs them quite a lot of money, because people visit the other lounges, which then charge back to British Airways for each visit. So perhaps they're actually trying to save a few pennies by having a better experience in the Terminal 3 lounges. So we'll see what happens with that. There was less good news with Finnair announcing a super light fare for short haul. They already have a light fare for a business class, but if you have status with British Airways or One World, then a lot of the issues with the light fares actually don't matter, because you still get your seat selection and luggage, etc. through One World, so it hasn't really been a problem. With super light, it won't matter whether you have One World status. The only exemptions are for people who are members of Finnair Plus and have certain status. I'll put a link as usual with all the full details of it. But with this new fare, you will not be able to take anything other than one small bag, like a sort of small rucksack that fits under the seat in front. So you won't be able to take a wheelie bag unless you pay extra. So I don't think this is particularly good news. It feels a bit like a very low-cost airline like Wizz Air or something that charged for a normal size hand luggage. But obviously you can pay more for a higher class fare and take your normal luggage. But what we don't know at the moment is what the sort of price differences will be. So I'm going to try and keep an eye on the prices at the moment and then compare them when they change, which is the 1st of June. So if you are planning to book any Finnair flights, make sure you book them by the 1st of June, because some other changes are coming as well. If you book before then the old rules apply. The other changes include the luggage allowance for business class, which I think is a real shame. So you will no longer be able to take 2 bags. You'll only be able to take 1 bag at 23 kilos. And if you have One World status, you will still not be allowed to take anything bigger than 23 kilos, which is unusual, because in most airlines you'd be able to take up to at least 30, if not 32 kilos. The only good news is you can still take an extra bag if you have One World status, so at least you can still do that. But personally, I don't want to take an extra bag a lot of the time. It's cumbersome to carry around. I'd rather just have a few extra kilos in my luggage, particularly if you go away and you want to buy a few things. I think it's definitely a downward trend from Finnair, unfortunately. They have been struggling a bit since COVID and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because unfortunately most of their routes overflew Russia, and their main business model was about quick connections to Asia, which obviously now is a much longer flying time for them because they have to avoid Russian airspace. But I do think these are going in the wrong direction, which is a great shame, because I think generally they're a great airline. I really like their new seats. I think the food on board is good, and their staff are extremely consistent and always very friendly and helpful. So there's been a bit of a backlash on social media to this, so it'll be interesting to see whether actually it continues. So for the main part of the programme, I'm going to talk about the apps and websites that I find useful when travelling. Now, the first one is very obvious, and I'm pretty sure everybody uses it already, and that's Google Maps. But I just wanted to cover a couple of things that you may not know about. So firstly, you can actually download the maps before you go. So if you're planning to go somewhere where you don't have the correct SIM card, or it's going to cost a load of money to use data and you weren't planning to get a local SIM card, then downloading the maps beforehand is a really good idea, because most rental cars now have Apple CarPlay or something similar, so you can just use Google Maps as your sat nav. But obviously if you've got no data, or perhaps if you're planning to travel through rural areas where there might not be a very good signal, it's a really good idea to download the maps in advance. I'll talk a bit about how to do that in a moment. Just to touch on the other feature which you will need to do before you save your maps is to make sure you have a Google account, because you'll need that to be able to download the maps, and also for the next feature, which is saving things. So I don't know if you've used it before, but it's a useful way to save perhaps places that you want to go. If you're going to a restaurant, or you want to remind yourself you want to go and see a particular site, then you can save it in different ways. You basically will tap on the thing on the map, and then it will come up with save as an option. And then there's 4 different options, including want to visit, or I think want to go there. There's a star, and there's also travel plans, which I don't really like that one because it's a blue colour, and because there are other things in exactly the same colour, it's quite hard to pick out if you don't know exactly where it is and you just want to quickly find something. So I tend to use the yellow star or the want to go there. Want to go there I tend to use if I'm not really sure, it's just one of several options. And the yellow star I tend to use if I'm definitely going there. I also like the fact you can add a label. So for instance, if you had a tour that started in a particular point, you could save the point that it starts at and then put a label, such and such tour starts here. So that's really useful. So make sure you do all that and you're signed into your Google account on Google Maps before you then go to download. So to find the offline maps, just touch on the initial, which is presumably the initial of your name or whatever you've used to create your Google account, which is at the top right. And then you'll see it says offline maps. Now you use this both to create the maps and also to find the ones that you've done before. So as I said, top right, you'll see an initial, which is your sign-in name, and then just tap on that and you'll see offline maps, and that's how you access them. To do the saved feature, then all you do is just find the cafe or whatever it is you want to save. Then if you look under, by touching on it, it will say things like directions, and further along it says save, and then tap on that and it will show you the different options and different colours of things. The next couple I'm going to talk about, I've mentioned quite a few times before, but I thought it was worth going into a bit more detail about them. So they are Seat Spy and Reward Flight Finder. They basically both do the same thing. There's a few slight differences between them, which I'll talk about. But what they do is they allow you to search for British Airways Avios seats very easily. So you can see an entire year at a glance and how many seats in every class, whether it's peak or off peak. And they also both have a function where you can actually search for what flights are available on Avios in whatever class you want on a particular set of dates. So if you perhaps are struggling to find availability for what you want, but you're stuck with having a certain week off work, for example, and you're not quite sure where to go, that can be a great feature to see what's available. And particularly if you're going to the US, the chances are if you could get somewhere near where you're planning to go, then you could just buy a fairly cheap internal flight and then just carry on to your final destination. So that's a really good feature. Both of them have some basic features which you can use for free, just a simple search. But if you want anything more, such as the alerts, then you will have to pay. The main difference between the two is Reward Flight Finder is for British Airways. At the moment, that's all they have. They did have Virgin, I think, at one point, but currently it's just British Airways. Whereas Seat Spy have a lot more airlines, but obviously if you're only interested in British Airways, you don't particularly need that. So Seat Spy have Lufthansa, Swiss, Air France, KLM, Virgin, and a few others, including Etihad. So it's worth having a look if you're a member of a few different programs and like to use your miles with them. I find them really useful. The main thing I tend to use them for is alerts. So if your seats that you want aren't available, what you can do is set an alert. Now this is part of the paid service, and you put in the date range that you're interested in for the outbound and the return, and when a seat comes up, it will actually alert you. Now this is useful if you don't mind what time you want to go at. If you're searching perhaps for, you've booked a really early morning flight but you'd rather have the later one, but there's no seats currently available, it won't tell you the difference. It will just come up and say there's a seat available, and then you've got to have a look at it. It does tend to alert in the middle of the night, I found, which can be a bit of an issue because if you don't pick it up straight away, obviously someone else might get the seat first, but it is really useful if you're trying to get some particular seats. I find quite often British Airways will release them on regular intervals, but obviously if you're just searching randomly, you've got no chance of actually finding them generally, because unless you happen to be really lucky and look on the day that they're releasing them, chances are somebody else will have got them first. Again, you can pay monthly, so you don't have to do this forever. If you're just wanting it for one particular trip, you could just pay monthly and then cancel it when you're finished with it. But I find it really useful, and they're fairly low prices. There are different tiers that you can have, and I'll put in some links below that explain all the different ones rather than go through it. But I think it starts from around $3.99, so it's pretty cheap per month, and well worth having, I think. Particularly, I should highlight at the moment, British Airways has been having some problems with their own website in terms of searching for availability. You might have noticed that it's not showing anything on the inbound flights to the UK for some reason. This is only on their equivalent of Reward Flight Finder, which is called the same, strangely, which is where you actually search by a whole year or per month, etc., not the main put in a specific date and destination. So it's well worth using Seats by a Reward Flight Finder if you're struggling to find seats and you're having that problem, and you're not looking for one particular set of dates. If you are, then with British Airways you can just put in the specific dates. So I definitely recommend for anyone that's using miles. It's really useful websites. There's not a lot of difference between them. I've used them both, find them both easy to use. Just depends on what you're looking for and obviously what special offers there are on at the moment, and whatever works out the cheapest and has the features that you want. So it costs $4.99 a month for the basic one, or $9.99 for the pro version. A couple of other things that you get with it that can be really useful is the aircraft change option. So it will send you an alert if the aircraft has changed. Now, this is useful because obviously if that happens, the chances are that you're going to lose your seats that you've booked. So it gives you a heads up, because sometimes from the airline you don't actually get to know that that's happened. There's also a schedule change, which is the same thing. So if there's a schedule change for your aircraft, then it will actually tell you this. Now, most of the time airlines are pretty good at telling you if there's a schedule change. However, if you book through something like Expedia, etc., or one of the online agents, and sometimes this doesn't happen, it can get lost and not come through to you. So it is quite useful for that. Or if you're using an airline that perhaps aren't quite as proactive as sending out alerts. So have a look at Expert Flyer. I'll pop in the link below, and also a link to an article that tells you a bit more about the different features. The next one I use a lot and I've used for many years. It's called TripIt. Again, there's two different versions. One is the standard version, which is free, and then there's also a pro version, which is paid. Now, most people probably will be fine with the standard version, because the main purpose of TripIt is to collate all your travel plans in one place. Now, the way I do this is by using email scraping. That means that it will have access to your email inbox, and it will recognize emails from airlines, from things like OpenTable, from hotels, from online travel agents, lots of different things, and it will recognize those and import them into your TripIt account. It then organizes them into trips, so that if you've got more than one trip, it should know the dates that are on each trip and sort of put them all in a folder together. However, I do find this slightly flaky, and quite often if you have things that perhaps aren't related to another trip, it will put them in a trip that is not meant to be there, and it can get a bit confusing. However, you can go in and just edit it manually and enter your own trip names, etc. So you can sort it out, but just beware it's not perfect, because obviously if you've got some places that aren't necessarily related, like you're flying via somewhere and stopping off, it can confuse it. But as I said, it's easily remedied. You just need a bit of time to go in and sort it out. that if you're worried about it having access to your emails, there's another way to do it, and that is you just forward everything to plans@tripit.com. So as soon as you get your booking in, you forward it on and then it will import it. You can also manually input your plans as well if there's something that it doesn't recognise, and just there's a whole different categories including transportation, restaurants, things like it will even recognise things like theatres and concerts. So I find it really useful for someone that does a lot of travelling, or if you don't want to rely on your emails, it's really handy because it actually has access offline. Now I've been caught out by this before when I've landed somewhere and had to fill in a form and not had the exact address of something, and no access to a mobile service because it's somewhere where it's costs a fortune. So actually that's a really useful thing to use for just getting your plans really handy offline. Like if you're on the plane and you want to access something, you can see it all there. The Pro version is useful in that it does flight monitoring. So if there are any changes to your itinerary, it will only do it in the last few days of it. So it's not all the time, but yeah, it will monitor it and tell you things like when it's time to check in, and if there's a flight change, if there's a gate available, if there's a delay. It does all of that. So I find that quite useful as well. Quite often it's actually ahead of British Airways in telling you where the gate's going to be or when there's a delay. So it's very useful. But I would say one note of caution is don't rely on its delays things, because quite often it will say there's a delay and then British Airways will do something behind the scenes and sort it out, and then the delay goes. So don't turn up late or something because TripIt says it's going to be delayed. Always go on what the airline says, and always turn up on time unless they say otherwise. I'll talk a little bit about Flighty just whilst I'm talking about flight monitoring. Now Flighty is a relatively new app. It does have a free version, but I find that's not really worthwhile. The paid version is definitely the one to have. Again, I would only really recommend it if you're someone who's either a bit of an av geek and likes to have all your flight details and statistics, or if you're someone that travels a lot and is interested in things like delays and gates, etc. So it does the same as TripIt pretty much, but in a much nicer way visually, with maps, and it will pop up and tell you there's a delay. It will tell you when the gate is, tell you it's time to check in, what the aircraft is. If there's a change of aircraft, it will notify you. I find that useful because, again, as I said earlier, you might need to change your seat. So it's a flight monitoring app. It's relatively new, but I find it very user-friendly and very useful for knowing when things are changing or going wrong. Next is Get Transfer. So this is, as you might expect, about transfers. If you are somewhere and you don't want to use Uber, or perhaps there isn't somewhere where there is Uber, or it's late at night and you don't want to rely on the perhaps being a taxi, or in fact you'd like something a bit more luxurious, this allows you to put in details of what transfer you're looking for, and then local drivers will basically bid for your business and come up with a price, and then you can see their rating as well. So it will range from a standard saloon car to something more fancy, to a proper chauffeur. I've used this a number of times and generally find it quite cheap compared with other things. Obviously in London you've got Wheelie, which is something similar, where perhaps it's a little bit more reliable because they're all drivers from Wheelie, but otherwise, I find using this Get Transfer is usually a bit cheaper than Wheelie, and it is quite a useful service because it works in many different countries. And finally, I will just mention Get Your Guide. Now, you might have used Viator, which is very similar. Get Your Guide is a relatively new player in that space, and I find them slightly better than Viator. Prices are similar, but I just think visually the Get Your Guide app is a bit nicer to use, a bit more user-friendly and a bit more choice. So they basically have transfers and tours and transportation in places all around the world, and pretty much all of them you can do just using the app. You don't need to bother with printing things out anymore or collecting tickets, and I will generally use that above other apps when I'm trying to find something in terms of a tour. Well, from Seneca Shore Vineyard here in Finger Lakes in New York State, that's all for this week. Until next time, happy travels.